Hello, my name is Ewan Coombs. I go by Sid Lloyd. I'm a multidisciplinary artist and sculptor, working with various mediums. And sort of, kind of like, first of all, I'm sort of going to like start off, work your bugger. Hey, that's good. Basically, I'm going to start basically sort of talking a wee bit about sort of some of my sort of practice, which got me sort of selected with the Elysium Sculpture Award, the Emerging Artist Award. So basically, sort of with my practice, it's sort of like I fell in love with more or less impermanence, and sort of like things which are basically sort of areas where like sort of how can I put this in the most beautiful way possible, shite things where like dirt builds up. It's kind of where things life starts to creep in from, and I think for me that kind of I fell in love with that. So seeing these little sites where basically sort of surrounded us, which often go unseen and noticed. How can I put it? It's like it's a to come from sort of like almost like sort of conglomerate of materials. And I kind of fell in love with this. And with that, then I fell in love with the gutters and things which sort of often sort of outline the buildings, sort of they're this sort of thing which is safe and sort of like, protects the structure around us, but often goes unseen. And sort of when it fails, sort of you start to then notice it. And for me, then sort of I was quite fascinated by sort of this idea of a prima material, this first material, a thing where sort of life can originate from. And I kind of wanted to create these basically structures that sort of talked about, not talked about, basically sort of explored. So basically, it created sort of a skeleton of sorts, a sort of a structure which then sort of people sort of both maneuver around and sort of interact and sort of basically perceive and sort of with that then sort of I was kind of fascinated basically for having I wanted to create some of these spaces then sort of which sort of explore these impermanence, not impermanence, just sort of that developing and gathering of shite and sort of the beauty within that. And sort of then with the Elysium sculpture, I really started to sort of like, I think for me initially sort of like I kind of looked at sort of what the work I was doing was had this sort of a great sort of like permanence. It was a very sort of like very he was there physically, but it was also kind of quite still and sort of basically sort of kind of moving on from that. Then sort of I wanted to sort of explore sort of going the complete opposite, being sort of working with materials which stop me from being so. I'm going to be put how can I say perfect and sort of like when things which are sort of you have to have it and it's set and it's finished and doesn't change, and that kind of led me to some materials which are inherently awkward and things which you can't set down because I worked with ceramics, and this is ceramics which I love ceramics. Basically it's the clay and the dirt, and basically for me I where the landscape where I'm from basically in Swansea Valley in sort of basically a place called Cumtoch, and I love it. And it's a place where basically it's a post-industrial landscape. It's a place where there's been heavy industry, there's been sort of constant extraction of the landscape and sort of these scarifications, so these remnants left behind. And often as well, sort of heavy pollutants, sort of left within the landscape as well. Things which I often find like in the rivers, like wee bits of lead, sort of bits of pipe and stuff like this, amongst other things. And sort of with that, then I was kind of quite fascinated by materials which you couldn't really set down. Sort of, and that led me led me to lead, and sort of basically sort of with this material, I loved it because it's such a awkward mix of both highly toxic, but yet also something which is inherently sort of something you can't be precise about. It constantly shifts and bends and alters under its own weight. And so for me, then sort of again, there's this kind of it's this formlessness, this sort of this thing which I cannot be controlling. I have to sort of give over and sort of this, which I love, which I sort of mentioned, showed of an exhibition, this exhibition, and this one of the Axis show was it's this thing of it changes. It changed over the course of the exhibition. Things started to wilt or wilt almost basically, sort of like flat, like leaves, like sort of like nature in the surroundings. It started to shift and change, and it started to bend under its own weight, under its softness. Because the lead is a very obscure, it's heavy as hell, but it's soft and it's malleable. And it's, so with that, then sort of I kind of started to explore then how basically sort of like, bodies of language, so bodies of language, sculpture and material language can start to alter and sort of change within the space in a sort of why did you change it? Ew. And sort of like leading into basically sort of the American residency with basically the Freeman Foundation, sort of and Neil Rock, and sort of it's really sort of it's sort of what that sort of redid is it got me out of my comfort zone. It made me quite sort of I'll be honest, scared, and it was good scared though. Sort of it was this beauty of sort of it's not sort of not having any materials for me sort of thing. We were able when we were there to access materials, but one thing which I really sort of loved and sort of kind of took from my home is this idea of wandering and sort of like small is sort of I think was one artist when we were out there, we had one-to-ones, had basically mentioned put hit the nail on the head was basically sort of quiet acts of resistance. Um, and there's this thing of basically, and it sounds terrible saying this, but I I did a lot of trespassing and a lot of wandering off and going behind buildings and things which were inherently quite sort of off Off permittance basically sort of stops you from going into certain areas. And for me, I'm a wanderer. I love wandering. I love sort of finding my place, finding myself in places which I shouldn't be, but equally sort of kind of fell in love with. And so for me, then I started to create these small acts of sort of basically small interactions. So, say seeing, for instance, there's like a small brewery on site, and sort of basically seeing that they dump seed across the road, and sort of basically taking these over more or less to this building, or the fact there's a train tracks alongside, and there's this constant bang of the trains going over, and these sort of just like screeching of it as you're in the middle of the night. And I loved it. It was a very beautiful mix of both. Again, I think with our home basically sort of a post-industrial space, it was basically somewhere where actually consistent industry continuing actually. So there's a bit of a back and forth. And then with that, then sort of I started to create these things which which I want to explore more or less, is basically the idea of, temporary artworks, things which are sort of there for that moment in time, something which you cannot, you cannot bring with you, yeah. And it's something which is, again, sort of it's more of the documentation as being sort of key to the existence of that art in itself, not having a physical being, but instead having something which is inherently sort of just about that material in that space, and those who happenstance to see and sort of interact with it. And even often sort of I like the sort of notion that sort of, again, this is a site behind a bunch of buildings where they dumped a bunch of materials. And what I saw was basically sort of I was kind of fascinated of seeing this. It was an ongoing dumping site as well. So, I kind of loved the sort of notion of someone interacting, seeing who the hell's layers, standing up these pipes and sort of walking them out to this space and giving motion to these things which often are motionless. And then sort of, with that, then sort of really, I think working alongside Heidi was basically, I started to get sort of a reappreciation because I always loved tactility and sort of, basically being really hands-on with the material. But I think for me then sort of being sort of more aware of how, being more open and sensitive to a material, like sort of how it's okay to be that way. So I started to sort of take on that sort of thing from sort of interacting with Heidi and sort of seeing this sort of, it's okay to be sensitive and sort of, let that sort of a wee bit of, how can I put it? It's you don't have to sort of be having it. Hmm. Yeah, just basically, yeah. For me, it was basically just sort of letting my guard down a wee bit, and I sort of started interacting with materials, which sort of often were quite sort of, I think again, sort of carrying on from that led sort of things which I couldn't control, so to speak, or things which also controlled me, and so that led me in sort of languages of obedience, languages of control, and sort of systems of control of, again, really this thing of this harshness which have really kind of started to influence my practice, and you'll see within the PULP show. And so basically then going on from that, then so we had the North Wales residency, which is this really mad of obscure, incredible residency working with basically but six Finnish artists and six Welsh artists, me and Heidi being two of them. And sort of it was really sort of just working materials, which again, it's really kind of it started. It felt like almost like sort of kismet almost, sort of it was right place, right time. Starting to work with materials again, which I couldn't be sort of not safe. What I was going to say, be sort of precious about, and we had to burn them at the end of the thing as well. So it really sort of like it kind of let me sort of loose on sort of just working with materials and going big scale for me. And sort of what I wanted to do was actually with this piece, I don't know why. I think it was for me. It was the thing which I wanted to explore was things of basically memory of like sort of constructed objects. And for me, it went to dens, sort of like these sort of spaces with which then sort of we occupy, and often sort of like things which I did as a kid, sort of these grubby, knackered bits of wood. I would sort of lean up and sort of like just hide and watch birds flutter past and sort of foxes take shits in the forest. And I loved it. And it was like this obscure sort of thing. And for me, then I started to explore about that and sort of materials and sort of interweaving basically sort of material string and sort of tightening and sort of seeing the sort of interaction between a material which wanted to go one way and sort of controlling and seeing how it sort of interacted within the space. And sort of again, go back. And the burning, the burning was a really mad experience to sort of see your work literally just, and sort of, just like one work there was just went up like a bloody inferno. I loved it. And sort of, again, it was for me as well, sort of, it was a chance to be sort of iterative and sort of say, okay, here's one form which took on this shape, and like, how can I sort of take on and reorganize it, sort of reposition, sort of how does that change and how does that alter how we perceive things? And again, and I really sort of again sort of this idea of impermanence and not having something which exists and sort of something which also on a visual plane as well. I kind of fell in love with this idea that what is this idea of art as something has been sort of you have to see straight away, but instead of something which is as you approach, you start to see it, perceive it, you start to see it. And it kind of linked me to this idea of basically way off tangent. It was quantum physics and this idea of Basically, when this is only just like sort of, I'm only making sense for myself because some of these things are I'm fascinated by, but yet I don't fully understand them. So it was this idea that particles, when observed, act differently to when they're not observed, and I kind of I fell in love with that this idea sort of that something constantly was changing, sort of constantly sort of shifting, and when we saw it, and it changed in a different way to what it was. And I kind of with that, then I want to sort of I was starting to see the sort of these links between both but see the awareness of our surroundings and sort of seeing the surroundings in a different light, and again coming around to that walking and sort of wandering, and sort of that led me then to yeah, basically with our pulp show, and sort of again sort of just really, being in space, be interacting with Heidi and sort of seeing the sort of way of our materials bouncing off each other and sort of seeing the languages, seeing sort of both sort of very similar but being very awkward at the same time, sort of both having this harshness of my metal against sort of these beautiful sort of softness of the fabric, and sort of seeing how you could be, sort of sensitive and touching of the knots, but then sort of something which the wire is just inherently sort of stopping, basically, sort of. And for me, I started to look at again, basically Michel Foucault's basically sort of oh, what was it? It was crime, not Crime and Punishment. It was just along these lines of basically it was basically it talked about how basically certain structures can have an effect within our perception of something and how it can sort of change. So it's like why are you doing this? Ah, they're changing. Hey. So basically, I was kind of fascinated with this ideas of things like the gibbet, which is this horrible little thing, obviously, sort of it's for like suspending bodies and sort of like holding and positioning something, and sort of with me then sort of like with these. It was something which I was quite fascinated with, this idea of sort of positioning and showing something, and this the ability of a structure to leave a permanent or impermanent mark within the mind, and our perception of something, and sort of seeing that sort of is sort of leaving traces in the marks of our mind, and also alters how we perceive and interact with a space. And often, which I saw them within the landscape, it was these trace elements going back and way at the start of the post-industrial landscape. There's something of these old structures, these things falling apart, even agricultural language as well. Again, wires which start to knot and thread, and you grow into like a thicket. Something which is sort of it's become so horribly and welcoming, something which you see it and you see even just a bit of thin bit of wire stops you from crossing a field. And for me, that kind of annoyed me, but also sort of fascinated me how sort of something so basic can have such a control over how we perceive and interact. And I sort of wanted to explore that language in itself. And then with that, then sort of taking in sort of um, how can I put it? What I saw often as well is nature's ability to be in itself quite beautifully awkward. And sort of it didn't stop, it didn't back down, it sort of started to take back in its own right. And the very same way I was talking right at the start of the gutter, sort of the sites of detritus and then life coming from it. It's always this constant push back and forth of landscape and materials. And sort of going hand in hand. So for me then I wanted to explore sort of wee bits of that sort of controlling of space, and sort of and again sort of this one area I want to sort of perceive interact with food and furthermore, which I think just the exhibition really sort of was a beautiful chance to sort of like show something which I wouldn't I actually quite frankly didn't feel comfortable showing, or sort of it was like more it's the first time of this sort of a video performance for me, sort of like it was a chance just to sort of just do something which I initially wouldn't have done, and sort of and so yeah, so with this then sort of videos became a way of this is mine on the left next to Heidi's, like, sort of showing a process of knotting, and with mine it's this process of twisting and like, sort of this act of basically sort of almost strangling or tensioning around a tree, and sort of just like the tightening of the hands, and sort of that sort of almost like both a sensual but sort of awkward and pleasantness of sort of interacting with a material so harsh. And sort of again, it's just that, and with me, I think this show really sort of was a quite beautiful sort of like chance to sort of just recombine and sort of glue together in sort of obscureness all these different sort of traits and traces of within sort of me noggin. And yeah, so yeah, it's just yeah, it's really sort of great experience, and sort of yeah, and thank you so much, and sort of here's my end of my mad talk. So yeah, thank you so much, guys.